Rome and the imperial parchment trembled in Senator Quintus's hands as he read, "Tonight bring your wives to the palace." Everyone knew what this meant. In recent weeks, 3 aristocratic families had received similar invitations. The husbands returned mute, the wives never spoke again, and the children began having nightmares that lasted decades. Caligula had discovered the perfect weapon, transforming humanity's most sacred act into an instrument of absolute terror. In the heart of history's greatest empire, a young emperor was rewriting the rules of human dominion, proving that there exists something worse than death, the complete destruction of the soul. And if you, just like me, are fascinated by stories that reveal how absolute power can transform human beings into monsters that defy our understanding, subscribe now so you won't miss the next chapters of this investigation into the most disturbing secrets of ancient history. And tell me in the comments from which country you're watching. I always read them, and am amazed by how these dark stories from the past connect people from all over the world who seek to understand the limits of human nature. Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, whom the world would know as Caligula, grew up in an environment where death was more common than breakfast. At 6 years old, he watched his father Germanicus die by poison. At 10, he witnessed his mother Agrippina be exiled and tortured to death. His 2 older brothers simply disappeared one night, executed by imperial order. For a boy from the royal family, surviving meant one thing: learning that showing any genuine emotion was signing your own death warrant. Tiberius, the emperor who orchestrated this family massacre, kept Caligula close, not out of affection, but as a living psychological experiment. For years, the boy was forced to dine with the man who had murdered his family, to smile at the one who had destroyed his childhood, to show gratitude for being alive. This sadistic education created something unique in history: a psychopath with access to absolute power and an intimate understanding of how trauma can be used as a weapon. When Tiberius finally died in the year 37 after Christ, Rome exploded in celebration. Caligula, at 24 years old, was seen as the savior who would free the empire from decades of paranoia and seclusion. Crowds shouted his name in the streets, senators competed to demonstrate loyalty, and even slaves whispered hopes for better days. The young emperor's first act seemed to confirm these expectations. He freed political prisoners, distributed money to the people, and organized grand spectacles that made Rome feel powerful again. But in the palace's private quarters, disturbing signs began to emerge. Praetorian guards reported strange behaviors. Caligula walked the corridors during the early hours, whispering to himself conversations with invisible people. Personal slaves began disappearing without explanation, replaced by others who seemed too terrified to speak. The young emperor who smiled publicly during the day was developing in the shadows of night a growing and sickly curiosity about the limits of human fear. These strange behaviors intensified dramatically when, in late 37 AD, a devastating brain fever nearly killed Caligula. For 3 weeks, the entire empire held its breath, while the young emperor, delirious between life and death, screaming names of dead people and fighting imaginary battles against invisible enemies. Imperial physicians worked day and night, but they knew they were losing not just a patient, but possibly witnessing Rome's collapse. When Caligula finally awakened, something fundamental had broken in his mind. The closest courtiers noticed immediately. His eyes didn't focus the same way. His conversations jumped between topics without logical connection, and more alarmingly, he had developed a disturbing fixation on testing limits. The illness didn't just damage his brain. It removed the last vestiges of self-control that imperial education had built, unleashing decades of repressed trauma in a psyche now equipped with absolute power over millions of lives. Caligula's thirst for domination began almost casually, but soon would reveal a mind that transformed every human interaction into a laboratory of horror. It all started with Marcella, a young slave who served wine during his private meals. On an apparently ordinary night, he ordered her to undress completely before continuing to serve. When she hesitated, Caligula showed no anger, only a cold and scientific curiosity about how far he could push someone before they broke. What followed was a systematic escalation that revealed the mind of a natural predator. Caligula began summoning groups of slaves to his chambers, not to work, but to entertain. He created degrading competitions where men and women were forced to perform intimate acts with each other while he took mental notes on their expressions of shame and desperation. He discovered that sexual humiliation didn't just break his victims, it rebuilt them as extensions of his will. But the true revelatory moment came when he decided to test these methods on someone of superior position. Marcus Flavius, a young military tribune, was summoned for a private strategic meeting. Caligula forced him to watch while his own wife, also summoned under false pretenses, was subjected to the same experiments he had perfected with slaves. The expression on the tribune's face, a mixture of horror, helplessness, and hatred that gradually transformed into total submission, was like a drug to Caligula. In that moment, he understood something revolutionary. He had discovered a form of domination that transcended death or physical torture. When you force someone to watch or participate in the sexual degradation of someone they love, you don't just break the body, you infect the soul with a shame that reproduces infinitely. The tribune left that room as a different man, unable to look at his wife, at himself, or at any symbol of authority the same way. It was then that Caligula realized he had in his hands not just a tool for personal pleasure, but the ultimate weapon of political control. If he could transform a proud military officer into a broken puppet in a single night, imagine what he could do with entire senators, with their families, with Rome's very power structure. The experiments had ended. It was time to begin the true work. And the opportunity for this true work came in the form of Senator Lucius Valerius Maximus and his wife Claudia. Unlike the experiments with slaves and lesser military men, this would be the first time Caligula would test his methods on one of Rome's most respected families. The Valerius were untouchable, or at least so they believed. Their lineage traced back to the Republic's founders, their wealth funded entire temples, and Claudia was considered the perfect model of the Roman matron, beautiful, devout, mother of 3 promising children. When they received the imperial invitation to discuss investments in the eastern provinces, they walked through the Palatine with the natural confidence of those who had never questioned their place at the top of the social hierarchy. Caligula received them in a room decorated with his finest tapestries, offered the finest wine, and spent an entire hour genuinely discussing family business. Then, as casually as one changes subject to comment on the weather, he ordered Claudia to undress completely and kneel before him. The silence that followed lasted eternities. Lucius tried to protest, but Caligula simply pointed to the Praetorians at the door and smiled. "Senator, you have 3 children at home, beautiful boys. It would be a tragedy if something happened to them because of the mother's stubbornness." In that moment, both understood they were no longer operating under the rules of Roman civilization. They knew. What happened in the following 5 hours transformed forever not only their lives, but established the template that Caligula would use to systematically destroy the entire Roman aristocracy. When they left the palace at dawn, Lucius and Claudia couldn't look each other in the eyes. 3 days later, she hanged herself in the family villa gardens. Lucius never spoke again in Senate sessions and died 2 years later, according to doctors, of profound melancholy. Caligula had just proven he could kill entire families without spilling a drop of blood. Claudia Valeria's suicide sent shockwaves through the Roman aristocracy, but Caligula interpreted the tragedy in a completely different way, as incontestable proof of his method's effectiveness. If a single session could destroy one of the empire's most powerful families, imagine what an organized system could achieve. In the weeks following Claudia's funeral, the emperor began developing what he called family audiences, a meticulously planned calendar of summons that would transform sexual terror into state policy. The system was diabolically simple and devastatingly effective. Caligula created different categories of audiences based on the social status and political usefulness of target families. Senators with Republican tendencies received invitations for matrimonial consultations, where their wives were subjected to the worst abuses. Wealthy merchants faced business meetings where their daughters became currency. Military generals participated in honor ceremonies where they witnessed the complete degradation of their family lineages. But the system's true malevolent genius lay in its calculated progression. Caligula discovered he could completely break the masculine spirit by forcing them to actively participate in their own family's humiliation. First, men were obliged to watch passively, then to hold or position their wives and daughters, finally to directly participate in the acts, transforming them from victims into accomplices of their own family traumas. The result was the creation of a new social caste in Rome, zombie families that continued to exist publicly but were dead inside, men who could no longer exercise authority because they had lost any sense of personal dignity, women who became ghosts of themselves, incapable of genuine intimate connections, children who grew up in homes where silence and shame were thicker than air. Caligula had weaponized sex so efficiently that he managed to kill the soul of the Roman aristocracy while keeping their bodies alive as walking monuments to his absolute power. The success of the family audience system created a logistical problem that Caligula solved in characteristically disturbing fashion. The Palatine Palace hadn't been designed to accommodate mass degradation spectacles. The emperor summoned Rome's best architects under the pretext of modernizing imperial facilities for more elaborate receptions. None of them suspected they were being hired to design what would become history's first architecturally planned sexual torture complex. The modifications began discreetly. Traditional audience halls were expanded and gained elevated observation levels, officially to accommodate more important guests during ceremonies. In reality, these bleachers allowed entire families to be forced to watch their loved ones' abuse from multiple angles. The main hall was redesigned as a small amphitheater with a sunken central area, supposedly for artistic presentations, but in practice, functioning as a stage where noble women and children were forced to perform acts that destroyed their souls. The corridors were strategically reorganized to create what Caligula called preparation paths, long winding routes that victims were obliged to traverse naked, passing by windows where other prisoners could see them before reaching the main halls. Every step of this journey was calculated to increase humiliation and terror, creating a degradation ritual that began long before the sexual act itself. But the most sinister modification was the creation of rooms with special glass walls, an expensive technological innovation that allowed one-way vision. Families were separated and placed in adjacent chambers where they could see but not prevent what happened to their loved ones. Fathers watched daughters being abused through these windows, knowing that any attempt at intervention would result in even worse tortures. Caligula had transformed architecture into an accomplice of his crimes, creating spaces that amplified psychological trauma in ways no previous tyrant had imagined. The Palatine ceased to be a palace to become a psychological war machine built in marble and gold, where every column, every corridor, every room had been meticulously planned to maximize human suffering and consolidate imperial power through systematized sexual terror. The Palatine's architectural transformation reflected an even deeper change in Caligula's mind. He had begun to see his sexual practices no longer as personal indulgences or political tools, but as divine manifestations that deserved official religious status. In 39 AD, The emperor announced his divinity to the Senate and began reformulating the entire Roman religious structure to incorporate what he called sacred imperial mysteries, a euphemism for mandatory sexual rituals performed in his honor. The first temple dedicated to divine Caligula was erected within the Palatine complex itself, adjacent to the newly constructed audience halls. Unlike traditional Roman temples, this sacred space was designed specifically to accommodate physical worship ceremonies, where citizens would demonstrate devotion through sexual acts performed for the emperor god. Vestal priestesses, who had maintained vows of chastity for decades, were forced to break their sacred oaths publicly as a form of consecration to the new divine mysteries. Traditional religious ceremonies were systematically corrupted and incorporated into the imperial sexual cult. Festivals that celebrated the earth's fertility became mandatory orgies where noble families were obliged to copulate publicly to guarantee the empire's prosperity. Marriage rituals came to include the imperial blessing, a euphemism for the emperor god's right to consummate the nuptials before the groom himself, transforming every matrimonial ceremony in Rome into a public demonstration of absolute sexual power. Caligula created an entirely new priestly hierarchy where religious status was determined by willingness to participate in imperial sexual rituals. Families that resisted were declared impious and excluded from all aspects of Roman religious life. More insidiously, children born from unions blessed by imperial rituals were considered especially sacred, creating a generation that would grow up seeing systematized sexual abuse as religious norm. The result was the creation of a system where resisting Caligula's sexual abuses was not just political treason or personal cowardice, but religious heresy punishable by death. He had achieved something no tyrant before him had reached, transforming his sexual crimes into sacred obligations, forcing his victims to participate in their own degradation not just out of fear, but out of religious duty, before an emperor who had proclaimed himself a living god. The elevation of sexual abuse to the status of religious obligation created an impossible dilemma for Roman noble families. To resist meant heresy and death, but to submit destroyed everything their ancestors had fought for through generations. In response, a clandestine resistance network developed that operated in the shadows of Roman society. Desperate families trying to protect what remained of their dignity through increasingly extreme and tragic methods. The resistance began with secret codes developed among aristocratic matrons. Messages about floral arrangements were actually warnings about upcoming imperial summons, while discussions about culinary recipes concealed plans to hide young daughters in distant convents or remote rural properties. Some families went so far as to purposefully disfigure their most beautiful daughters, discreet but permanent scars they hoped would diminish imperial interest, sacrificing physical beauty to preserve moral integrity. But Caligula had anticipated these resistance attempts with the calculating coldness of an experienced chess player. Families that mysteriously failed to appear at summons faced thorough imperial investigations. Daughters who disappeared were tracked by informant networks that extended throughout the empire. When found, they were brought back not only to participate in the originally planned rituals, but for public punishment sessions that served as warnings to other families. The most desperate resistance method was collective suicide. Entire families began choosing death before dishonor, performing joint poisoning rituals in which all members, fathers, mothers, children, died simultaneously to escape imperial claws. Initially, these suicides were treated as family tragedies, but when Caligula perceived the pattern, he implemented a diabolic policy. Suicide families had their properties confiscated and their names removed from all public records, transforming them into non-people whose existence was erased from Roman history. The cruelest resistance of all was forcing some families to choose which member would be sacrificed. When the Cornelius family tried to hide their youngest daughter, Caligula offered a choice. Either the girl would present herself voluntarily, or he would also take the two older sons. The family was forced to deliver one child to save two others, creating traumas that would extend through generations and forever destroying family bonds through mutual guilt and remorse. The desperate attempts at family resistance only fed Caligula's growing megalomania, who interpreted each act of defiance as proof that he needed to expand his control over Roman sexuality even further. In early 40 AD, the emperor convened an extraordinary Senate session to announce what he called the Great Moral Reform of the Empire, a decree that would make his sexual rituals mandatory not just for the aristocracy, but for all Roman citizens. The bill presented to the Senate was a document of terror, disguised as religious legislation. Every Roman citizen, regardless of social class, would be obligated to participate in monthly imperial worship festivals, where they would demonstrate loyalty through public sexual acts supervised by imperial magistrates. Married women would be made available for service in imperial temples for periods determined by public lottery. Children from age 12 would be initiated into the sacred mysteries through rituals that were clearly institutionalized sexual abuse. Even more disturbing, the decree established a sexual surveillance system where citizens would be rewarded for denouncing neighbors who showed resistance to sacred imperial conjugal duties. Husbands who refused to deliver their wives, fathers who hid daughters, even couples who maintained private intimate relations without prior imperial blessing would be considered state traitors and executed publicly. The moment of total collapse came when Caligula announced the implementation date, the Ides of March 41st AD, exactly 100 years after Julius Caesar's assassination. The date choice was no coincidence. It was a deliberate provocation, a declaration that not even the memory of Republican heroes would be spared from his sexual corruption. Rome watched in horror as it realized the emperor intended to transform all Roman civilization into a gigantic extension of his personal sexual fantasies. It was at this moment that even the most submissive senators understood a terrible truth. Caligula was no longer just a sexual tyrant exploiting individual families. He had become an existential threat to the very continuity of the human species as Romans knew it. The empire that had conquered the world was about to be transformed into a sexual abuse machine operating on a continental scale, with future generations being raised to see degradation as divine normalcy. The proclamation of the imperial sexual decrees was the spark that ignited a conspiracy that had been forming in the shadows for months. But this time, the conspirators' motives transcended traditional politics. They were men driven by a thirst for revenge as deep as the trauma they had suffered. Cassius Chaerea, senior centurion of the Praetorian Guard, emerged as the natural leader not through political ambition, but because he carried in his veins the purest hatred a human being can feel. Chaerea had been forced to watch his own 15-year-old daughter be raped by Caligula during a religious initiation ceremony 3 months earlier. Even more devastating, the emperor had ordered the father himself to hold the girl's hands during the act, whispering that this was paternal participation in the sacred mysteries. The girl had hanged herself 2 weeks later, but not before begging her father's forgiveness for not being strong enough to honor the gods. Chaerea had never cried over a death, but he wept for this life he had destroyed with his own hands. The other conspirators carried equally heartbreaking stories. Cornelius Sabinus had been forced to prostitute his wife to common soldiers, while Caligula watched and took notes. Annius Vinicianus witnessed his 2 teenage sons being violated in rituals the emperor called virility blessings. Marcus Vinicius was forced to rape his own sister during a ceremony where Caligula celebrated family bonds through carnal union. None of these men conspired for republican ideals or personal ambitions. They wanted blood. The opportunity came at the Palatine Games on January 24, 41 AD, when Caligula was personally supervising a theatrical presentation he had modified to include interactive performances with members of the aristocratic audience. In the theatre's underground corridors, far from the eyes of spectators and guards, the conspirators surrounded the emperor with brutal efficiency that reflected years of military training and months of accumulated hatred. What happened in those dark corridors transcended political assassination to become collective exorcism. Each stab wound was not just an attack on Caligula's body, but a desperate attempt to kill the ghosts he had implanted in his victims' minds. When they finally stopped, the body was unrecognizable. 33 wounds that represented not just a tyrant's death, but the desperate attempt of broken men to recover some fragment of their lost humanity through the purest and most justified violence history has ever recorded. Caligula's death brought immediate relief, but the awakening to reality was brutal. The emperor had died, but his ghosts remained alive in the minds of hundreds of families. Claudius, the new emperor, faced an unprecedented crisis in Roman history: how to govern an empire where the ruling elite was psychologically fragmented and the very social structure had been contaminated by traumas that had no name or historical precedent. Claudius's first decisions revealed the magnitude of the devastation. Entire halls of the Palatine were permanently sealed, not out of respect for Caligula, but because no one could enter those spaces without suffering nervous breakdowns. Architects were discreetly hired to demolish and rebuild entire sections of the palace, erasing physical evidence that served as constant triggers for family traumas. The famous imperial gardens were replanted because many women couldn't walk through the places where they had been forced into outdoor ceremonies. More devastating was the silence that settled over Rome like an invisible plague. Families who had been victims of the imperial rituals couldn't speak about their experiences without reliving every moment of horror, but they also couldn't forget. Children who witnessed their parents' abuse developed selective mutism, speaking normally about everyday matters, but becoming catatonic when any topic related to sexuality or authority was mentioned. Marriages that survived Caligula's rituals existed only on paper. Spouses who could no longer touch each other intimately because every physical contact awakened memories of the moments when they were forced to participate in each other's degradation. The most lasting impact was generational. Children who grew up watching their parents be systematically humiliated developed completely distorted understandings about relationships, authority, and sexuality. Many became perpetrators in adulthood, replicating abuse patterns because it was the only form of intimacy they knew. Others became perpetual victims, unable to establish healthy boundaries because they had learned that resistance meant death. A third category simply avoided any form of intimate relationship for the rest of their lives, creating a generation of emotionally sterile Romans. Claudius tried to implement family recovery policies, subsidies for traumatized families, public festivals that celebrated traditional values, even the creation of temples dedicated to soul healing, but quickly discovered that some damage transcends political repair. Roman social fabric had been torn so fundamentally that entire generations would grow up carrying invisible scars, perpetuating dysfunction patterns that would extend far beyond the reign of the emperor who created them. Today, tourists stroll through the Palatine ruins, photographing broken columns and faded mosaics, without imagining they walk over one of human history's greatest psychological cemeteries. Tour guides point to room foundations where the emperor received dignitaries, without mentioning that these same stones witnessed the systematic destruction of hundreds of souls. What Caligula proved in his 4 years of reign transcends the horrors of his era. He demonstrated that absolute power can transform even the most intimate acts of human experience into weapons of mass destruction. His true legacy is not engraved in marble or bronze, but in the psychological scars that spread like a virus through generations. Roman families carried the abuse and dysfunction patterns created in his palace for centuries, creating a template of sexual terrorism that would be studied and, tragically, sometimes replicated by tyrants throughout history. Caligula didn't just rule through fear. He redesigned the very nature of human domination, proving that the destruction of sexual dignity can be more devastating than any form of physical violence. The most terrifying lesson of his story is that the methods he developed didn't die with him. In any era, in any place where human beings receive absolute power over others, Caligula's ghosts whisper possibilities that should remain unimaginable. His palace may be in ruins, but his true work, the discovery of how to use sexuality as a weapon of total control, remains as one of the darkest chapters ever written about the limits of human cruelty. If this journey through the darkest depths of human nature has impacted you, subscribe to the channel, because in the next episode, we're going to explore something even more disturbing. How the very children of Caligula's victims became the next perpetrators, creating abuse dynasties that lasted centuries. The story that history books prefer to forget is just beginning, and you won't want to miss how this cycle of horror perpetuated itself through Rome's most powerful generations.